By the final phase of World War II, the map of German airfields had turned into a complex network of active, destroyed, and abandoned sites. Some were erased by bombings, others overloaded with aircraft and constantly reassigned, and many more simply vanished from documentation, becoming faded marks on yellowed operational charts. One such site was a small field airstrip on the edge of a forested region, squeezed between a railway line and a marshy lowland. When, in early 1945, Rear Area Command staffs began searching for any available landing sites to disperse the remaining aircraft and support units, this particular airfield surfaced almost by accident. In an old archival box, officers found a folder with a brief reference: grass runway, several wooden hangars, fuel storage tanks, and a temporary servicing point. Its last recorded use was nearly 2 years prior. In a situation where every resource mattered, even this forgotten entry seemed potentially valuable. A small group of technical specialists and rear area engineers was assembled to inspect the location. Their task was to evaluate the condition of the runway, determine whether it could handle the aircraft of the time, and assess the presence of storage areas and infrastructure. The assignment appeared routine, identical to dozens of similar inspections conducted across the region. There were no indications in the archive documents that the airfield had ever served any special purpose. The trip took several hours. The truck carrying the engineers moved along rutted dirt roads, passing through half-destroyed villages and abandoned farms. Along the route lay remnants of anti-aircraft positions, scraps of camouflage netting, and rusted military equipment. Everything around reflected the collapsing front lines. The airfield itself lay far from major supply routes, which likely explained why it had been forgotten for so long. A first visual assessment from a nearby hill confirmed that the site had indeed not been used for years. The runway was overgrown with grass, cut through in places by wagon tracks from local farms. The wooden structures looked partially collapsed, yet one detail immediately stood out. Several large hangars built of metal and concrete remained intact. Their construction appeared far more modern than the dates listed in the documents. This discrepancy was the first sign that something was unusual. Upon arrival, the engineers began a standard inspection. They measured the runway length and soil density, assessed drainage, and documented surface irregularities. At first glance, the airfield required significant restoration, vegetation removal, surface reinforcement, and replacement of signaling equipment. But the main point of interest remained the massive hangars, positioned separately from the older wooden buildings. A closer look showed features typical of late-war construction: reinforced trusses, solid concrete foundations, and traces of intentional camouflage. There were no identifying markings of units or technical detachments on the doors, only faded layers of paint applied at different times. The locks seemed significantly newer than the rest of the metalwork, suggesting that the hangars had been accessed long after the airfield itself fell out of use. The internal documentation brought from headquarters did not help. The site was listed simply as a secondary airstrip, with no mention of specialized units or experimental operations. Yet, the hangars contradicted the official record. It appeared that at some point, the airfield had been repurposed, but the change had never been entered into the administrative system. Before opening the hangars, the engineers inspected the surrounding grounds. They found remnants of camouflage nets, fragments of wooden scaffolding, and broken packing crates. Markings on some of the debris suggested that assembly work had once been performed there. At the same time, the usual signs of a functioning squadron housing areas, ammunition depots, service tents were almost entirely absent. Everything indicated that the site had served not as a full-scale operational base, but rather as a specialized technical or testing location. Particularly unusual were the rail-mounted transport carts found beside a side track. They were designed to move heavy loads, their dimensions resembling equipment used in factory workshops. For a simple field airstrip, such machinery was out of place. It was becoming clear that the work done here had extended beyond routine supply or repair operations. Once the perimeter had been surveyed, the time came to open the main hangars. The locks were firmly secured, but given the inspection orders, opening them was unavoidable. The engineers reviewed all available information once more. There were no indications of stored ammunition, reducing the risk of accidental detonation. However, the possibility of remaining fuel or chemical substances used in aircraft maintenance could not be ruled out. A growing sense formed within the team that they were dealing with a site deliberately kept outside standard documentation. Such practices were not uncommon during wartime projects involving advanced development, often received special secrecy protocols. Isolated facilities like this one could function as intermediate production points, assembly posts, or testing areas known only to small groups of specialists. Still, no one expected anything extraordinary behind the sealed doors. The most realistic assumptions involved abandoned storage, partly dismantled machinery, or temporary repair stations. Considering the collapsing wartime infrastructure, such findings would have aligned perfectly with the broader pattern. The impending opening of the hangars was perceived as just another routine step in cataloging potentially useful assets. Yet the combination of structural modernity, traces of assembly work, and unusual logistical equipment created a subtle tension. The airfield, officially listed as secondary and forgotten, increasingly appeared to be something else entirely. The engineers stood at the threshold of a space whose true history had been intentionally concealed, and none of them could yet imagine what waited inside. The decision to open the modern-looking hangars marked a turning point in the inspection of the forgotten airfield. Until this moment, the engineers treated the location as another neglected secondary facility, one of many scattered across the collapsing infrastructure of late-war Germany. But the combination of reinforced structures, atypical transport equipment, and the absence of clear documentation gradually shifted their expectations. It became evident that these hangars had served a purpose not reflected in the official record. Before breaking the locks, the engineers carried out a more detailed examination of the immediate surroundings. They documented the concrete pads extending from the hangars, unusual for a field airstrip that originally relied on wooden structures. These pads showed marks indicating the movement of heavy machinery. Nearby drainage channels were built more robustly than required for ordinary aircraft service, suggesting the presence of equipment that generated significant heat or vibration. None of this aligned with routine aircraft maintenance operations. When the engineers finally cut the locks and forced open the heavy doors, a draft of stale, cold air emerged from the interior. Their flashlights revealed a vast hall with a clean, organized layout, unusual for a facility supposedly abandoned for years. Dust covered the floor, but beneath it were precise outlines indicating the placement of large equipment. Along the walls stood workbenches, tool racks, and brackets for mounting components. The absence of chaos suggested a controlled evacuation rather than hurried abandonment. As the lights swept across the hall, the engineers identified several large objects covered by heavy tarpaulins. Their shapes hinted at aircraft fuselages or major structural components. The size of the covered items exceeded what would normally be handled at a minor airfield, reinforcing the suspicion that the site had supported advanced or prototype aircraft rather than standard operational models. The engineers moved cautiously, aware that aviation fuel residues or compressed gases might still be present. On the far end of the hangar, they located a reinforced partition separating a smaller chamber from the main area. This section had been equipped with ventilation shafts and additional soundproofing. The configuration suggested activities requiring isolation, possibly engine testing or assembly of sensitive mechanical systems. A narrow observational window, now covered in grime, overlooked this chamber from a walkway above. Its presence implied that monitoring or evaluation procedures had once been conducted inside. The engineers uncovered the largest tarpaulin first. Beneath it lay the unmistakable skeletal frame of an aircraft, but its form differed from standard Luftwaffe designs. The fuselage was unusually narrow and elongated, with attachment points for wings positioned at a non-standard angle. The nose section lacked openings for conventional engines. Instead, it featured reinforced mounting brackets that seemed intended for an experimental propulsion unit. The engineers recognized immediately that this was not a production aircraft, but a prototype, or perhaps even an early developmental mock-up. Another covered shape revealed a similar structure, though in a more advanced state of completion. Its wings, stored separately nearby, were unusually thin and rigid, built around spars of unfamiliar alloy. The engineers noted the deliberate attempt to maximize aerodynamic efficiency at high speeds. This aligned with known late-war efforts to push aircraft performance beyond conventional limits, particularly in response to increasing Allied air pressure. The discovery of these airframes created a new context for the entire airfield. It no longer appeared as a forgotten logistical site. Instead, it resembled a concealed node in a broader network of experimental aviation efforts, projects that had expanded rapidly during the late stages of the war. As Germany attempted to compensate for material shortages with technological innovation. If the prototypes had been assembled or tested here, the airfield must have operated under strict secrecy. Further inspection revealed crates containing spare parts, partially assembled control surfaces, and documentation fragments. Although most of the documents had been removed, a few labels remained on equipment cases. These labels referenced research institutes and manufacturing plants known to have participated in advanced aeronautical programs. The presence of these materials confirmed that the site had been integrated into classified wartime development. Despite the aircraft not being intact, their remains provided valuable insights. The construction techniques, materials, and design elements aligned with emerging trends in experimental aviation. Streamlined fuselages, innovative wing shapes, and mounting points for next-generation propulsion systems. These features suggested attempts to produce aircraft capable of higher speeds, improved climb rates, or non-traditional flight performance. Yet the most striking aspect of the discovery was how effectively the site had been removed from the wartime record. The absence of official references implied deliberate concealment, possibly to keep the prototypes safe from air raids or espionage. The remote location, reinforced hangars, and stripped documentation all pointed toward a project intended to remain unknown outside a limited technical circle. As the engineers continued documenting their findings, a clearer picture emerged. This forgotten airfield had not been abandoned due to disuse. It had been evacuated intentionally, most likely during the rapid contraction of industrial assets under pressure from advancing front lines. What remained inside the hangars were silent witnesses of a program halted before it could reach full development. And while the prototypes were incomplete, their existence indicated a project far more ambitious than anything expected at a minor airstrip. The discovery of the experimental airframes changed the nature of the engineers' mission. What began as a routine inspection of a forgotten airfield now resembled an investigation into an undeclared segment of wartime aviation research. The existence of prototype components, reinforced structures, and specialized workspaces suggested that the site had belonged to a larger, classified program. However, the absence of complete documentation made it difficult to reconstruct the scale or objectives of the work conducted here. The engineers continued examining the hangar and its adjacent structures, searching for secondary clues that could clarify the facility's role. In a small annex attached to the main building, they found a workshop equipped with precision tools, jigs, and alignment fixtures typically used for advanced assembly tasks. Although the machinery was covered in dust, The layout indicated a workflow designed for high-tolerance mechanical components rather than routine aircraft maintenance. On a long table lay several discarded templates used for wing profiling. The engineers recognized distinct contours associated with aircraft intended for high-speed performance. The curvature of the aerodynamic surfaces suggested experimentation with reduced drag and improved lift characteristics, trends common in late-war German research aimed at countering Allied air superiority. The templates did not match blueprints of known production aircraft, reinforcing the idea that these belonged to a separate development effort. Outside the workshop, a lean-to storage shed contained several crates filled with alloy samples. Many of them bore markings, identifying them as experimental materials tested for strength-to-weight efficiency. These metals, though now oxidized, represented the advanced metallurgy pushed forward by wartime necessity. The presence of these samples implied that the airfield had been involved in evaluating materials for prototypes, perhaps functioning as a remote testing branch of a larger research institution. The engineers moved on to the second major hangar, which was structurally similar to the first but arranged differently inside. Instead of partially assembled airframes, the floor featured anchor points and mounting rails consistent with engine testing equipment. Although the machinery had been removed, the engineers could identify scorch marks along the ventilation ducting and signs of vibration stress on the reinforced concrete. These traces suggested that engines, possibly experimental, lightweight, or high-output models, had been mounted here for static trials. Additional data points came from an observation platform running along the upper level of the hangar. The platform included measuring stations equipped for vibration analysis, torque readings, and airflow monitoring. The apparatuses were incomplete, yet enough remained to indicate systematic testing. The engineers recorded the layout carefully, aware that even fragments could help reconstruct the kind of propulsion system being evaluated. At the far end of the platform, they found a small, sealed compartment. After opening it, they discovered a set of evacuated storage drawers containing only a few surviving items: metal fasteners, wiring bundles, and pieces of instrumentation. Many drawers were empty, confirming that the site had been deliberately cleared. Still, the remaining objects bore catalog numbers associated with organizations known for experimental propulsion research. This reinforced the idea that the airfield had been part of a covert program dispersed across multiple hidden facilities. Outside the hangars, the group extended their search to the surrounding grounds. They mapped faint tire tracks and traces of compacted soil, indicating that heavy transport vehicles had once moved regularly through the area. These paths led toward the forest, where they found the remnants of a partially collapsed access road. Its direction suggested a logistical route connecting the airfield to another, now unidentified support facility deeper in the region. In a drainage ditch near the runway, the engineers found a small pile of discarded metal casings. Most were too corroded for detailed analysis, but their shape resembled housings for electrical components or flight instruments. Their presence suggested that the area had served as a disposal point for outdated or failed prototype parts. The distribution of debris implied a process of repeated testing, evaluation, and refinement. By the end of the survey, the engineers had gathered enough evidence to conclude that the airfield had played a specialized role within a larger, clandestine project focused on advanced aircraft development. Although the exact nature of the prototype designs remained uncertain, the traces pointed toward efforts to achieve higher speeds, improved structural efficiency, and possibly new propulsion methods. Such objectives aligned with the broader pattern of late-war German attempts to create technologically advanced aircraft capable of countering the Allies' growing dominance in the air. What remained unclear was why this facility had been abandoned so cleanly, with almost all critical documentation removed. The systematic clearance indicated a deliberate shutdown, not a chaotic evacuation. Given the late-war timeline, this likely occurred during the rapid contraction of production and research sites as front lines approached industrial regions. To prevent sensitive information from falling into enemy hands, such locations were often emptied with precision before being left behind. The airfield, once a forgotten entry in an outdated archive, had revealed itself as a concealed fragment of an ambitious but ultimately unfinished technological endeavor. The incomplete prototypes and faint structural clues were all that remained of a program halted before reaching maturity. For the engineers, these remnants provided a rare glimpse into the hidden layers of wartime innovation layers, deliberately obscured, preserved only in the silent traces left behind. As the engineers completed their assessment of the airfield, the emerging picture became increasingly clear. The site had not been a forgotten auxiliary strip, as archival records suggested, but a discrete node in a concealed wartime development effort. Its infrastructure, partially cleared yet structurally intact, reflected careful planning and systematic evacuation rather than abandonment due to disuse or neglect. The incomplete airframes, alloy samples, engine testing traces, and specialized tools indicated that the facility played a role in a broader experimental aviation program. This program appeared to pursue advanced aerodynamic concepts and propulsion methods characteristic of late-war innovation efforts. The airfield's remote location, reinforced hangars, and isolated logistics routes aligned with practices used for protecting classified research from air raids and espionage. Although the exact scope of the program remained uncertain, its ambitions were unmistakable. Despite the absence of documentation, subtle clues hinted at the facility's operational period. Wear patterns on machinery mounts, the type of alloys present, and the construction style of the hangars suggested concentrated use during the last 2 years of the war, a phase marked by accelerating technological experimentation as conventional resources dwindled. This timing matched known accounts of dispersed, compartmentalized research networks designed to minimize risk and ensure continuity even under extreme pressure. Yet the most striking aspect was the precision with which the site had been cleared. The missing documents, removed equipment, and empty storage compartments demonstrated an organized withdrawal. Key components and records had been transported elsewhere before Allied forces advanced into the region. The engineers recognized that such an orderly evacuation was typical for priority research installations whose work could not be allowed to fall into enemy hands. The evidence suggested that the prototypes found in the hangars were only fragments of a larger sequence of designs. They represented early or intermediate stages, structural experiments, material tests, or aerodynamic trials. The real products of the program might have been moved to other testing grounds or absorbed into more centralized facilities. It was also possible that the program had been terminated abruptly, leaving behind only the less mature components that were not worth preserving. After cataloging every recoverable detail, the engineers compiled their report. The findings emphasized the unusual nature of the airfield, its role in supporting experimental aircraft development, and the potential connection to institutions known for advanced wartime research. However, the report could not answer the question of what became of the completed prototypes or where the missing documents had been taken. The most critical information had vanished long before their arrival. In the end, the airfield remained a fragment of a larger, obscured narrative. Its reinforced hangars and stripped workspaces stood as the last traces of an effort to push aviation beyond its contemporary limits, a reminder of the intense technological competition that defined the final years of the war. Though incomplete, the remnants provided a rare insight into hidden research conducted under extreme circumstances, revealing how innovation persisted even as the conflict approached its end. For the engineers, the discovery offered no dramatic revelations, only the quiet realization that they had stepped briefly into the shadows of a program designed to remain invisible. The prototypes, tools, and structural clues were all that survived of ambitions halted by the collapse of the war effort. The airfield, once overlooked and nearly erased from records, now stood as a silent testament to a project whose full story would likely never be reconstructed.